Yo, what's up? Welcome back to the next installment of the Apostate Bible Read. We are moving quickly through Leviticus. We're going to tackle a big chunk today, chapters 11 through 18, and check out my new tattoo. Sick! Okay, so these chapters are kind of repetitive, as a lot of the sections are in Torah, and there's a reason for that, because there's a lot of minute detail that I think out of context might make a little bit of sense to us, but might not make the full plenary sense as it would have to the people at the time for whom these laws were initially instituted. And honestly, I know that seems like a trivial point, but I really think that's quite important to understand because, again, I've said this before, but there's a lot of stuff we're going to miss out on. There's a lot of stuff that just won't seem to be as relevant or might seem a little bit weird or superstitious. So, like, in this section, for example, most of these prescriptions are about cleanliness and what happens. How do you overcome the cleanliness? How do you deal with the cleanliness? How do you become clean again once you have been exposed to that which has been deemed unclean? So one of the things is like that if you get some kind of emission from a man's body, like semen emission, then you have to be unclean for a certain period of time. And if you have somehow touched blood, because blood is the life of the creature, it says, right? And so then if you touch the blood, then you have to go through certain purification processes, right? And then of course for women, if they're on their menstrual cycle, then they have to deal with periods of uncleanliness and then be reintroduced to society through like sacrifices and through processes again of purification, cleanliness. And now some of this might just seem super fucked up, right? Like, oh, so this natural process that women go through, you're deemed unclean. Oh, what happens if you accidentally touch the blood of a creature? Oh, if shit gets on you. Oh, whatever. You know, like you touch a leprous person, which leprosy is a term that's used for a variety of skin issues. It could be just skin infections. It could be like something maybe even as simple as like fungal, like athlete's foot, or maybe like rosacea, and all kinds of maybe acne breakouts even maybe could have been seen as like leprosy in this context. So we might look at that now as like, oh my god, these people were like hypochondriacs, they were freaking out about shit, and maybe some of that even led to like issues of hierarchy and normalcy in the Foucauldian sense, that, you know, that which was deemed medically normal, well, not medically normal, but culturally normal at the time, was based on, you know, if you had clear skin, but if you had like leprous skin, or what was deemed to be leprous skin, then somehow you're like lower down on the social hierarchical pyramid scale. And same, you know, with women, you know, this is a perfect justification for women to be treated abnormally or something along those lines. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be aware of those things. There are critiques against those things that are extremely important to consider. But I don't want to linger too much on those things, and I want to just kind of take broad strokes right now. And if you want to do more research into that stuff on your own, I would really encourage you to do that. I need to do more of that. I know I spent a lot of time when I was doing my more like formative intellectual investigations on those things, and so there is a lot of research out there that is looking at these from a critical, historical, cultural perspective that can really dig into the nitty-gritty. Why were these things prohibited? Why were those things prohibited? What effects did those prohibitions have on the larger social fabric? Things like that. But just the thing that I want to just focus on right now that's really quite simple is just the very idea of cleanliness being separated from uncleanliness. Now, there might be a functional element that we need to be aware of here. That like certain foods were not to be eaten because maybe those foods were prone historically towards disease. And so people were aware that if you ate X type of food, if you were exposed to X type of emission, that the likelihood of infection or disease or something like that was increased, so therefore it became instituted and then imbued with a type of metaphysical value that made these laws seem to be kind of spiritual laws, right? So there is a functional element, but we live in a world post-Enlightenment that wants to kind of reduce everything to function. So there are certain critiques that really come out of like sociological critiques of religion, particularly Durkheim. You even get this with Weber, but like Durkheim, the Marxian tradition, a kind of post-rational critique that wants to view everything through a functional lens, right? So we want to kind of reduce everything to the biomaterial meaning that these things might have had, to the neglect of the metaphysical and the spiritual. And I think we need to realize that we're dealing with a people group for whom the separation sometimes what it's referred to as a separation between mythos and logos. Myth, story, totality, and logos, reason, rationality, the explanation through word, things like that. That separation is not as clearly defined in a lot of these ancient texts and for these ancient communities and ancient peoples. And so if we try to view what's going on in the Old Testament purely through a functional lens, like as in reducing everything to this meant this because these foods were diseased, or this meant this because these things led to bacteria, then we kind of miss something else that's going on here, which would be the more metaphysical element. That is something that is intimately ingrained in these prescriptions. So it can't simply be functional, even though there may be a functional element, but it can't simply be spiritualized, even though there's obviously a spiritual element as well. There's probably some sort of synthesis between those two, the functional and the spiritual, the material and the metaphysical, that helps us understand these prohibitions and these laws. And really, this is a larger point that we need to keep in the front of our minds, that we're dealing with a very different frame of rationality. That human reason, that human logic, that the human faculties and capacities that we think are just simply natural and essential and universal and objective and all for one and permanent all the time, are actually themselves constructed and influenced by the relations that we enter into, our socioeconomic relations, our familial relations, our spiritual relations, and that what we're dealing with here is something that we can't simply easily transfer into a present day, like post-enlightenment, post-democratic, post-capitalist context of rationality. So I think that's important for us to consider just moving forward, and something that we'll see really pronounced when we're looking at these prohibitions and prescriptions in the law. And then the last thing that I just want to re-emphasize, because I think it's so important, and I think we should pound this into our fucking brains as much as we're reading through this, that what we see here is, again, I talked about this a few episodes ago, is a depiction of society that is not concerned with the vertical heaven and hell, right? What we see is much more of a kind of circular and horizontal in and then out, right? The unclean are deemed that they have to go outside. Things have to be burned outside of the city. There's something that you're removed from the center of the community. The further away, the more unclean you are, the further away you must be placed from the most holy place. And that the most holy place is the tabernacle where God resides, who is pure holiness and pure perfection and pure purity and cleanliness. And we'll talk a little bit about that next, but the idea is that because God is set apart, and these are the people of God, that they too must be set apart and holy, and they must become people of cleanliness. And I think that's really important because, you know, we tend to think now of like religious narratives as being concerned with the afterlife and ascending to like a celestial place. Even if we realize that that's a spatial metaphor and it's not like literal, we still think of it as being eminently concerned with that which is afterwards, where we can transcend at the very least. If not, it's a literal ascension. We transcend to higher states of spirituality or whatever. But what you get here is a very sort of material and imminent set of concerns. It's about creating the social community that is concerned with preserving its cleanliness, preserving its order, whether it's the social hierarchy where the Levitical priests are at the top, or whether it's like maybe a gender hierarchy, or whether it's a racial hierarchy and how you treat the sojourners who come in, again, in versus out, right? Nevertheless, I think that's what we're going to continue to see, and I think we need to recognize that the framework that really establishes the socio-political and socio-economic and socio-ethical concerns of the ancient Israelites that does get carried over into Rabbinic Judaism, into Second Temple Judaism, and therefore that sets the framework in which the New Testament and the Christian narrative emerges out of, isn't primarily about the afterlife and the up and the down or the ascension and descension, but rather it's always primarily about the in and the out. Who's in and who's out? And how do we interpret that? How do we understand that? How do we treat the people who are as yet out, or the people who might temporarily come in, or the people who are in but then they do something that requires that they be pushed out, or whatever? How do we understand cleanliness, uncleanliness, in, out, etc., in a way that will help us to really kind of get to what it is that the ancient Israelites and then the context of the Second Temple Jews and the first century Christians, that will help us to understand how it is that they view themselves. And I think that will set a very different paradigm for how it is that we understand their theological musings as well. So something to really consider as we're like looking through these legal prohibitions about cleanliness and how it is that you can become reintroduced back in, even though you never really were, you didn't forfeit your position. It's not like you forfeited and you're going to hell. No, it was never that. That type of language is never really used here. Now, you might be an abomination, or you might touch certain things, and that might be viewed as like a profanation, like profaning of that which should be pure. But there's always a sort of a technology of the law through the sacrificial system, through processes of purification to bring you back in. And that, I think, is extremely important that we understand. Because, again, the unilateral covenant that was made with Abraham means that there's a guarantee that the nation of Israel will not forfeit, if you will, its status as being the chosen people of God. So this isn't like a conditional thing, like, oh, if you sin, you go to hell kind of thing. That type of language does not exist at this point. This is about maintaining the political community, the cultural systems, the traditions, the socio-economic, socio-political, and socio-ethical frameworks as being whether or not you are pure, whether or not you are following them righteously, or whether or not you are as yet outside, or you have somehow strayed, and then how can we then bring you back in once you have become outside or strayed? Or how could we welcome in the stranger and then incorporate them into this process? So that's kind of, I think, extremely important for us to consider. All right, sweet. So that is probably taking us halfway through to Leviticus, brings us up to chapter 19, which will start tomorrow or the day after. So like, subscribe, get your friends involved, get sick tattoos, whatever the fuck else you want to do. Peace, I love you.